On February 6, 2014, a team of Finnish cavers visited Norway to go cave diving through Plura Cave. What they didn't know was that their journey would end up becoming one of the most harrowing caving disasters in the country's history. However, what made this already tragic event even more devastating was the fact that one of the divers, 46-year-old Kai Konkanen, was all too familiar with the dangers of cave diving firsthand. He had lost his close friend and longtime diving partner during an exhibition through Montola Quarry in central Finland just a year earlier. Yet within months, he was back, preparing to dive into one of the most treacherous underwater cave systems in Europe. This time, he was joined by 4 other elite divers, including 42-year-old Patrick Gronqvist, 40-year-old Jari Huotarinen, 34-year-old Jari Usamaki, and the youngest, 33-year-old Vesa Rantanen. The plan was to enter through the submerged opening in the Plura River and exit through a second entrance. But pulling it off successfully wasn't going to be that simple, largely since Plura is the deepest known cave in northern Europe. The connection between the 2 entrances was also discovered only recently, so there wasn't much information on how to navigate it successfully either. This newly discovered route descended over 130 meters into pitch-black icy water, with brutal cold and tight squeezes, further adding to its extreme difficulty. Even if everything went according to plan, the dive would have still taken 5 hours to complete, and in such brutal, unpredictable conditions, the margin for error was nearly zero. Any deviation from the carefully planned route, equipment failure, or a single tear in a dry suit meant a slow, freezing death. With all this in mind, the group went to the starting location on the 6th of February and cut a triangular hole in the ice to start their descent. But instead of diving all at once, the team split into 2 groups. Jari H. and Patrick went first, using underwater scooters to conserve energy, and the other 3 followed 2 hours later, giving the sediment time to settle for clearer visibility. This was a crucial precaution, since sunlight barely penetrated more than a few meters into the cave, so any loss in visibility could have proved fatal. Fortunately, things started off on the right note. After descending 34 meters over the first 500 meters, the divers eventually reached a partially flooded, air-filled chamber that was over 250 meters long, giving them a brief resting point before the steep and challenging descent ahead. But surprisingly, they encountered little resistance on their way to the deepest section of the Plura Cave, and for a brief moment, they allowed themselves to believe the entire mission might actually be this effortless. Unfortunately, they couldn't have been more wrong, something they came to realize after reaching a shockingly narrow section of the cave with a sharp turn. A fully geared diver could barely squeeze through, but at this point, forward was the only way out, so Patrick decided to go first. However, as he was thinking of how he could navigate the turn, Jari H's flashlight suddenly went out and then began flashing quickly. As Patrick turned back to see what was going on, he saw Jari begging for help. One of his bailout cylinders had gotten caught in the surrounding environment, preventing him from moving forward. Even worse was the fact that he was panicking, which at that depth is practically a death sentence. Patrick tried to calm him down, but there wasn't much he could do in that situation. The space was too tight, and one wrong move could rupture the suit or damage his gear, so he decided to focus on the core issue at hand. He let go of his scooter and carefully swam back to shift the bailout cylinder a few meters forward, helping Jari free himself. But when he swam back to check on him, the situation had spiraled into something far worse. Yari's breathing regulator was somehow out of his mouth. Patrick put it back in as quickly as he could. Unfortunately, it was already too late. Yari's lungs were already full of water, ending his life in the process. With his friend's lifeless body floating in front of him, Patrick wanted to scream, but he couldn't. He had to stay calm, otherwise he was going to become the next victim of Plura's cold, indifferent depths. After taking some time to collect himself, Patrick checked his dive computer to see how long he'd have to stay submerged to avoid decompression sickness, and to his horror, it flashed 400 minutes. This was a haunting increase from the 120 minutes he saw earlier. What was supposed to be a 5-hour dive was now going to take as much as 9, and staying there any longer would only increase this time even further. So with no other option, Patrick turned away from his friend's body and began to swim towards the second entrance. Now, with no one else to keep him company, what he failed to realize was the second team was heading straight into the nightmare he'd left behind. Following the original plan, the remaining 3 divers set out exactly 2 hours after the first team. But as they descended to the deepest section, Vesa heard a distress signal coming from someone's diving equipment. Fearing the worst, he swam toward the sound, only to be greeted by the very outcome he was dreading. he saw his friend Yari's lifeless body blocking the narrow tunnel ahead. It was too much for him to even look at. Unfortunately, the narrow passage gave him no other choice. If he wanted to move forward, he had to face it head-on. Now, he could have turned back, but that meant spending up to 12 hours underwater, with no guarantee their oxygen would last that long. Meanwhile, Yari Yu, who was just behind Vesa, came face to face with the same tragic situation. But unlike Vesa, he lost his composure almost immediately and began to panic. Kai, the last diver on their team, tried to calm Yuri Yu down, but it didn't work. Panic underwater turned lethal in minutes. His breathing became extremely erratic, eventually resulting in Plura claiming the life of Yari Usamaki as well. Kai rushed to inform Vesa about what happened, only to find him violently kicking, trying to squeeze past Yari H's body. He urged Vesa to stop and turn back, but Vesa refused. With no other choice, Kai decided to go back the way he came, alone. By this point, he was convinced that Vesa would also die just like the others. But by some miracle, Vesa managed to make it through not long after Kai turned back. At this point, 3 survivors were swimming alone, each believing he was the only one who made it out alive. Patrick and Vesa were heading toward the Stein Uglaflaglet dry chamber, while Kai was slowly making his way back to the Plura entrance. And after 8.5 hours in the water, Patrick was the first one to reach the surface around 9 p.m., with Vesa emerging just an hour later. On the other side of the cave, Kai broke through the thin ice covering the pond's entrance at around 1:30 a.m., and he dragged himself into the van they all originally came in. He didn't know if Patrick or Vesa were still alive, but he held on to hope and began waiting for them to arrive. Fortunately, he didn't have to wait long. The two reached the van around 2 a.m., marking the end of their horrific journey through the underwater cave. But as terrifying as Plura was, it was far from the only cave to test the limits of human endurance. The Veryovkanut Cave Incident. Just 4 years later, a descent into the world's deepest cave would also turn into a horrifying struggle to stay alive. One that made Plura look almost merciful. Veryovkanut Cave, hidden deep in the mountains of Abkhazia, plunges over 2,200 meters into the earth, and fewer people have reached its bottom than have ever been to space. So in September 2018, a team of Russian cavers led by Pavel Demidov decided to face this challenge head-on for a second time, because as it turns out, they had already accomplished this feat just months earlier, when they not only reached the cave's bottom, but also measured its record-breaking depth. The only difference was that this time, they were joined by 2 new faces: British cave photographer Robbie Schoen and his assistant Jeff Wade. They had 2 goals: photograph the cave's extraordinary terrain, and also collect samples of possibly new species of shrimp and scorpion, both of which would help them study how life was able to sustain itself somewhere with absolutely no sunlight. But exploring this cave required an extensive amount of preparation. Each caver had to haul over 30 kilograms, or about 66 pounds of gear, while being wrapped in layers of thermal clothing to survive the cold. And the descent was just as brutal. To enter, they had to lower themselves through a narrow vertical shaft that dropped 32 meters straight down, and that was the easiest part, because the only way down from there was through thousands of meters of narrow, twisting tunnels. Reaching just the first camp, 600 meters deep, took around 8 hours. Fortunately, this was also their first rest stop. You see, unlike most caves that can be explored in a single day, Veryovkanut takes multiple days just to reach the bottom, so the previous cavers had to set up 6 underground camps, where explorers could dry off, eat, rest, and mentally prepare themselves for crawling through mud and water, squeezing their bodies through awfully narrow passages, all while risking hypothermia due to the cave's near-freezing temperature. Luckily, things were on schedule for Pavel and his group, and after 4 days of brutal descents, they finally reached the deepest camp. The plan was to stay there for over a week, explore the deepest tunnels, and photograph the surreal turquoise lake at the cave's end. And that's exactly what they did for the first 6 days. They even managed to collect some samples of the tiny organisms living in that darkness. However, this calm and peaceful exploration came to a sudden, crashing halt on day 7, when the first ones to face this upcoming disaster were Roman and Natalia, 2 team members who had left just over a day earlier to catch a flight. After a deafening roar, thousands of liters of water came crashing into the cave, flooding it without warning. They immediately contacted the rest of the team at the bottom through a cable line that was installed earlier. However, Robbie and the others weren't as worried as they probably should have been. Flood pulses weren't rare in deep caves, and they usually passed quickly. The group at the bottom assumed that this would be no different and went on with their activities. Tragically, they were dead wrong. A little while after the warning came in, water exploded from a chasm just meters from their camping spot and began filling the camp. They prayed for it to stop, but it didn't. By the time they realized the true gravity of the situation, the water level was already dangerously high. They had waited too long, and now the entire chamber was about to end up underwater. But just when it seemed all hope was lost, Robbie sprang into action and quickly suited up in his caving gear. He then clipped himself to the rope leading out of the cave and started climbing. However, this climb was going to be a lot more difficult than he'd imagined. Water was beginning to fill up the routes they took during their descents. Facing impossible odds, Robbie clenched his jaw and pushed forward, ready to take on whatever lay ahead. The water pressure was strong enough to make it a struggle just to breathe, but he endured. He knew that he was in the lead, and if he failed here, everyone behind him might get trapped. After hours of struggle, he finally reached a relatively dry section of the cave where the water had diverted down a different path. He also found an anchor point, and for the first time in what likely felt like an eternity, he was able to get some rest. He was also able to breathe a sigh of relief when, just a few minutes later, Wade appeared there as well. Turns out, he'd been following just behind Robbie the entire time. However, while they were relieved to see each other alive, neither had any idea if the Russians had made it out. In any case, there was no time to wait. The water level was still rising, and if they waited for the rest of the group, they'd be trapped again. After several more hours of a slow and excruciatingly difficult climb through near-freezing water, Robbie and Wade managed to reach the camp at 1,900 meters deep. Then, 15 minutes later, they saw headlamps flicker in the distance, and to their surprise, the remaining 5 Russian cavers emerged from the darkness. They all had barely made it through as well. However, this was no time for happy reunions. Fortunately, after 20 long hours in the camp, they noticed the water starting to recede. This was the signal they needed to ascend their climb and finally reach the surface after 4 more days of walking and climbing. They had survived the impossible, escaping from a cave that could have just as easily become their tomb. That said, while the threat in Veryovkina was something tangible, rising water, the dangers faced by Ted the Caver were far more mysterious and possibly supernatural. The story began in 2001 when a man named Ted published a series of blogs detailing his experience with a bizarre cave. In his first entry, dated March 23rd, Ted described a caving expedition with a friend he referred to only as B. The trip, which took place in December of 2000, led them deep into a remote cave and to the discovery of something strange. Deep inside a small chamber, accessible only by descending over ledges and crawling through tight passages, they found a narrow hole just a few inches wide. This hole intrigued Ted because there was a steady, howling wind blowing from it, which made him believe there was an unexplored chamber just beyond it. And the thought of exploring that chamber, somewhere no human has stepped before, excited him to no end. After examining the hole, Ted and B determined that if they could open the hole somehow, there was just enough space for one of them to reach the other side. So they went back and returned a month later on January 27, 2001, with the tools to widen the hole. But even with these tools, this was going to be a slow and exhausting process. The space around the hole was also too tight, forcing only one of them to work at a time. It took them 2 days to increase its size by just a couple more inches. However, they didn't let the slow progress discourage them from their ultimate goal. And that's when things started to get weird. Not only did the howling grow louder, it was now accompanied by a deep, rumbling sound that wasn't there before. They tried to convince themselves the rumbling was just trucks passing along a nearby mountain highway. But deep down, they knew that road wasn't nearly busy enough to create a sound so constant. Things became even more unsettling on February 10th, when they entered the cave with B's dog. She had explored caves with them before, and the two were hoping to put her into the tunnel behind the hole to see how far it went. But something immediately felt wrong. As soon as they approached the work site, the dog became agitated and refused to go anywhere near the hole. After several unsuccessful attempts to make her go through the hole, they went back to their original plan, widening the passage just enough for one of them to squeeze through. But as B was drilling near the hole, he heard yet another unexplainable noise. It sounded like someone grinding a rock against other rocks from deep within the tunnel. Ted assumed B's ears were just ringing because of the drill and urged him to continue. And by the end of the day, they had managed to carve out the hole just wide enough to fit a head through. But just as they were getting used to the strange noises, the two heard a loud, screeching scream echoing from within the hole on March 3rd. Ted described it as the most terrible scream I've ever heard. This terrified him enough to quickly seal the hole with rocks and wait in silence. But when several hours passed and nothing happened, the two went back to work. As much as it scared them, they wanted to know what was on the other side even more now. And as luck would have it, they were able to make the hole wide enough to fit Ted on their next visit. Though it was still an extremely tight squeeze. He could barely move forward with his arms pinned to the side. Still, he pushed on and eventually made it to the other side. He was determined to reach the end and find the answer to all the bizarre sounds. But what he found on the other side left him with even more questions than before. The hole opened up to a surprisingly roomy chamber with a large stone leaned against the wall. However, this stone was way too round to be something natural. Near this stone, he also spotted strange hieroglyphic-like markings on the wall, depicting a group of people surrounding a mysterious symbol. Now more confused than ever, Ted squeezed back through the hole and told B everything. The two decided to come back with someone else who could help them make sense of what Ted saw, and returned with a friend named Joe on April 14th. Unfortunately, as Joe and Ted were about to crawl through, Ted slammed his head on the cave wall and got a concussion, leaving Joe with no other choice but to explore the new chamber alone. Joe entered the tunnel and didn't come out until much later, far longer than the trip should have taken. However, the more pressing issue was the condition he came back in. He was pale and shaking. When asked what happened, he said only, "I don't feel good," and walked out of the cave. Even after they made it back outside, Joe never spoke to them again, leaving them to wonder what he could have seen in that tunnel that shook him so badly. Ted and B needed answers, so they returned again on April 28th, this time with proper equipment like a two-way cable phone and a camcorder to capture everything inside. Just like before, Ted went in alone and eventually reached the large room with the strange stone again. But as he was exploring the area, a grinding noise echoed from behind. He stood too fast from the shock and slammed his helmet into the rock ceiling, breaking his headlamp. Ted fumbled for glow sticks in his bag, while fearing what their green glow might reveal. When he cracked one, however, the room was completely empty. He then reached for the phone. No response. The line was dead. He cracked another glow stick and threw it towards the stone, and that's when he noticed something that nearly had him screaming. The round stone had moved. It was now sitting on top of the phone wire, likely severing it in the process, which would explain why the phone wasn't working. But he had a bigger question in mind. Who or what moved that stone? That's when he felt something crawling behind him. He didn't have it in him to look back. All he could do was run back. However, as he crawled through the narrow tunnel, a rotting stench poured in behind him. It was thick, wet, and suffocating. He popped out of the hole, gasping for air, but before he could gather his thoughts, the two heard the scraping sounds coming from inside the hull once again. This sent them running for the exit. Ted ran after B, who had already begun climbing out. As they reached the cave's entrance, the rope they were climbing began to move. Something was pulling it back. Luckily, both of them made it to the top before whatever was chasing them could catch up. And without a second thought, B pulled out his knife and cut the rope, sending it falling back into the darkness below. However, that wasn't the end of Ted and B's story, because a few weeks later, Ted posted another update to his blog, reading, "For my family and friends who are reading this, I say, be at peace. I will conquer this cave. Then I will return and update this website immediately. I will include any photos we take in the cave today, and if you stop by the house, I will show you the video I will have. I expect to be home later tonight or tomorrow at the latest. See all of you soon with a lot of answers. Love, Ted." This was the last thing Ted ever posted on the internet. Meanwhile, Ted's caving story spread like wildfire. People obsessed over what might have happened in that cave, and whether Ted made it out alive. Over the next 2 decades, different theories about what happened to Ted emerged across the internet. Some believed he and his friends were taken by a demonic creature lurking in that cave. Others claimed the opening behind the stone was a portal to another world, but all these theories were proven false when the YouTube channel Nick Boddick released an interview with Ted himself. And as it turned out, most of it was fake. While he did explore a creepy cave, the hole and the supernatural elements were entirely fictional, created only to tell a chilling story. True or not, it remains one of the most unforgettable cave stories to ever grace the web.